For about 60 years, if you wanted to know how much computation you could bring to a problem, you only had to ask one question. What can a chip do this year?
And the answer improved on a schedule. Not because anyone was being clever about your particular problem, but because the entire industry moved forward together, and you moved forward with it whether you did anything or not.
Then, somewhere around 2010, one line on that chart stops behaving like the others.
It doesn't bend upward a little. It detaches. It climbs at a slope that has almost nothing to do with what any individual chip is doing. And then it keeps climbing for more than a decade without rejoining.
And the sentence everybody reaches for is that AI broke Moore's law.
Which is exactly the kind of sentence this series exists to take apart. It didn't. Those are two different quantities, measured in different units, and one of them cannot falsify the other. We'll spend a whole scene on why that phrasing is wrong, because getting it right is the difference between understanding what happened and just being impressed by it.
But something did change, and what changed was direction, not speed.
For 4 episodes, the machine has been the constraint, and the idea has been the thing waiting. This is the episode where the idea stops waiting and starts telling the machine what it ought to be. Quick note, this is education, not advice of any kind. AI moves fast, so treat it as a map, not gospel, and go try it yourself.
Quick callback, one line each, because the shape of the previous 4 matters here more than in any episode so far.
Episode 1. The idea arrived decades before any machine could test it. Episode 2. When the machine couldn't test an idea, the field started reading untestable as refuted, and a generation of work was written off. Episode 3. Machines finally arrived, purpose-built and spectacular, won in public, and still didn't generalize because the judgment inside them was handmade by people.
And episode 4 is the turn.
Episode 4 is the accident. Conventional processor scaling broke on physics. The industry pivoted to parallel hardware aimed at video games. And that pivot happened to produce exactly the machine a 20-year-old idea had been waiting for. Nobody planned it. That was the whole point of the episode.
So across all 4, hardware leads. The idea is downstream of whatever happens to exist.
Downstream in all 4. And in 3 of them, the idea loses. Either it can't be tested at all, or it gets misread as refuted, or it wins narrowly and then doesn't travel anywhere.
So what specifically changes now?
The arrow reverses. After 2012, the method stops being a passenger. It starts specifying what hardware should be good at, and within about 5 years, there is silicon and production designed around it. That had essentially never happened for a general AI method before.
Which sounds unambiguously like progress.
It mostly is, and I don't want to be sour about it. But it introduces a failure mode we have not seen anywhere in this series yet. And by the end of the episode, I'd like that failure mode to be the thing you carry out, rather than the growth curve. The curve is the easy part.
Let's start with the measurement, because there's a good one, and it's considerably more careful than the number most people quote.
In 2022, a group at Epoch published an analysis called Compute Trends Across 3 Eras of Machine Learning. They assembled a large dataset of machine learning systems going back to the 1950s and estimated how much computation went into training each one.
And what came out wasn't one trend.
It was 3 regimes, and I want to quote their phrasing directly because the precision is the useful part. Before 2010, quote, training compute grew in line with Moore's law, doubling roughly every 20 months.
So for the first 60 years of the field, AI's appetite for computation grew at roughly the rate that computers themselves were improving.
Then, quote, since the advent of deep learning in the early 2010s, the scaling of training compute has accelerated, doubling approximately every 6 months.
20 months down to 6. That's a bit more than 3 times faster, sustained for over a decade.
And then a third finding, which is the one that usually gets dropped in the retelling. Quote, in late 2015, a new trend emerged as firms developed large-scale ML models with 10 to 100-fold larger requirements in training compute.
So there's a separate tier of very large, very expensive runs sitting above the main trend. Does that tier have its own rate?
It does, and it's the counterintuitive part. Epoch puts the large-scale trend at roughly a 10-month doubling, which is slower than the 6-month main trend. Those runs sit much higher on the chart and climb less steeply. And here's what I want to be careful about, because it's easy to draw this wrong. That large-scale trend runs alongside the deep learning trend. It does not replace it. Most of the field carries on at the lower level, while a small number of extremely expensive runs sit well above it.
So if you draw these as 3 consecutive segments, one era ending, the next beginning, you've drawn it wrong.
You've drawn it wrong. And worse, you've implied the whole field moved. It didn't. A small and well-funded part of it moved a very long way. And that distinction turns out to matter enormously by the end of this episode. If you want one number for the whole span, Epoch says that training compute has grown by a factor of about 10 billion since 2010.
Sit on that first era for a moment, because 20 months is a suspicious number.
It's suspicious because it's approximately the rate at which the chips themselves were improving. And that isn't a coincidence. It's a description of how research actually worked for 60 years.
Meaning you ran your model on whatever was in the building.
You ran it on the machine you had access to for about as long as you could justify occupying it. And the amount of computation that represented went up over time because the machines got better underneath you. Almost nobody was choosing a compute budget. The budget was whatever the hardware handed you that year.
So that slope is really a hardware slope wearing a different label.
That is precisely what it is. And if you want a one-sentence summary of episodes 1 through 4, that's it. For 60 years, the amount of computation available to an idea was set by somebody else's manufacturing roadmap. And there was no way to buy your way past it that made economic sense.
Which explains the shape of every failure we've covered.
Turing's storage estimate that no machine of his era could meet. The perceptron work that couldn't be scaled far enough to answer its own critics. The expert systems machines. The 2 decades neural network spent being not wrong, but under-resourced. Every one of those is what it looks like when your ceiling is set externally and moves on somebody else's timetable.
And then the ceiling stops being external.
Then it stops being external, because it turns out that if the workload splits across many machines, you can simply buy more machines. And once that's true, the manufacturing roadmap is no longer the thing that binds you.
Now the number everybody quotes, and I want to do this in the right order. Say it first, then correct it, rather than quietly using the better one.
In May 2018, OpenAI published a short analysis called AI and Compute. It looked at the largest publicly known training runs and found that the compute used in them had been doubling roughly every 3.4 months since 2012. And there's a neat seam with last episode here. The appendix works its example off AlexNet, quoting the same sentence we used, that the network takes between 5 and 6 days to train on 2 GTX 583GB cards.
So last episode's closing evidence is this episode's first data point.
It's the first data point on the chart. And over the window to 2018, they put the total increase at more than 300,000 times, from AlexNet at the bottom to AlphaGo 0 at the top.
That number went absolutely everywhere.
It went everywhere, and it's the version most people are still carrying around. So here's the correction. It's drawn from a small set of landmark runs over a short window, essentially the biggest, most attention-getting results of one particular 6-year stretch.
And Epoch's dataset is broader.
Much broader, across far more systems and a far longer period, and it gives about 6 months rather than 3.4. Epoch's own write-up phrases it as 5 to 6 months. That's the number I'd want you to keep if you only keep one. And worth noting, the 2 sources don't even agree on the early era. OpenAI puts the pre-2012 doubling at about 2 years, Epoch at 20 months. Different datasets, different definitions, both defensible. They're separate measurements, not one fact.
Doesn't that deflate the story somewhat?
It deflates the headline, and it strengthens the argument. And that trade is always worth making. 6 months is still more than 3 times faster than the pre-2010 rate, sustained across a decade. The correction doesn't remove the phenomenon at all. It makes the claim survivable.
And a claim that survives contact is worth more than one that impresses.
Which is more or less the method of this whole series. If you go around quoting 3.4 months, the first person who shows up with the broader dataset takes your entire argument away from you, including the parts that were right. If you quote 6, nobody can, because 6 is what the careful measurement says.
Let's make the size of this concrete, because very large multiples stop meaning anything past a certain point.
Take the general purpose trend as your baseline. Call it a doubling roughly every 2 years. 6 years of that is 3 doublings.
Which is 8 times.
About 8 times. And you can check that on your fingers. I'd genuinely rather you did that than take a comparison from me, because comparisons in this area get repeated badly. Worth saying that OpenAI ran the same comparison in that post and published 7 times rather than 8, because their 300,000-fold figure is measured from AlexNet to AlphaGo 0, about 5.5 years rather than 6. Same argument, slightly shorter window, and their number is the one to cite.
And the measured figure over that window is more than 300,000 times.
So the gap isn't a few percent, and it isn't a factor of 2 or 3. It's roughly 4 orders of magnitude between what the chips were handing you and what was actually being spent on the largest runs.
So where did the other 4 orders of magnitude come from?
Not from chips getting better. That's the entire point of doing the arithmetic out loud. The per-chip trend contributed the 8. Everything above the 8 came from somewhere else, and the rest of this episode is an answer to where.
Which is also why AI broke Moore's law is the wrong sentence.
It's the wrong sentence because Moore's law is a claim about how many transistors you can economically put on a single chip. Training compute is a claim about how much arithmetic somebody chose to purchase and run. Nothing about the second falsifies the first. They aren't even the same kind of statement. One is about manufacturing, the other is about spending.
It's the episode 4 correction again, one level up, and there's a detail in that same OpenAI post that makes the point better than we can.
At the foot of the page, there's a correction notice, dated November 2019. It reads, "We originally quoted Moore's law as an 18-month doubling time, so the single most cited source behind the phrase AI broke Moore's law shipped with the wrong definition of Moore's law and had to publicly correct it 18 months later. Same correction, different decade." In episode 4, the mistake was blaming Moore's law for something Dennard scaling did. Here the mistake is crediting Moore's law with something a purchasing department did. Name the quantity before you claim it changed.
So let's decompose it, because AI compute grew very fast is a description, not an explanation.
3 contributions, and they are genuinely not the same kind of thing. The first is simply more chips. Instead of one machine, you use hundreds and then thousands, wired together with fast interconnect, all working on a single training run.
Which is an engineering and capital story rather than a physics story.
Almost entirely. Nothing about any individual processor had to improve for that to happen. Somebody built a bigger building, filled it with hardware, and solved a very hard distributed systems problem. Those are real achievements. They're just not the achievement people think they're describing.
Second contribution?
Chips better suited to the workload. This is the one component that's genuinely a hardware progress story. Silicon that performs the specific arithmetic these models are built out of, more efficiently per watt and per dollar than a general purpose part would.
And that's the part that feeds back into this series argument.
That's the part where the loop closes deliberately rather than accidentally. And we'll spend 2 scenes on it because it's the actual subject of the episode.
And the third?
Capital. Somebody decided to spend enormously more money than anyone had previously spent on training a model. That is not a technological trend. It's a choice made by a small number of organizations for reasons that include the science but are not limited to it.
Why does it matter so much to keep those 3 separate?
Because if you blur them, you get a technology inevitability story. The curve went up, so it was always going to go up, so it will keep going up. But 2 of those 3 components are decisions rather than trends, and decisions can be reversed or simply not made again next year.
I want to use one system as a hinge because it sits exactly on the seam between the old pattern and the new one.
March 2016, Seoul. AlphaGo plays Lee Sedol, one of the strongest Go players of his generation, over 5 games, and wins 4-1.
And the obvious comparison is episode 3.
It's the right comparison, and it's a genuinely instructive one. Deep Blue in 1997 was a machine built for exactly 1 game, with hundreds of custom chess chips, and the chess judgment inside it was hand-built by people who understood chess.
And AlphaGo also plays exactly 1 game.
It also plays exactly 1 game. So from the outside, it looks like the same story repeating. A spectacular, narrow, purpose-built result that impresses everyone and then goes nowhere.
But the inside is different.
The inside is a completely different kind of object. What's running on the hardware is a general learning method. The evaluation of a position isn't encoded by human experts. It's learned from data and from self-play. And the very large amount of compute is being spent on that learning, not on searching a handwritten scoring function faster.
So it's problem-shaped on the outside and method-shaped on the inside.
That's a good way to put it. And the giveaway is what happened afterwards. The same family of methods went on to other problems entirely, which is exactly what Episode 3's machines conspicuously could not do. You couldn't point Deep Blue at anything but chess.
So it's the last of the old kind and the first of the new kind at the same time.
And it's the far end of OpenAI's measurement. The 2017 version, AlphaGo 0, is the data point sitting at the top of that 300,000 times line, which is a neat illustration of how much of that growth went into a single research program.
Now, the part I think is most underrated, because it's where the constraint changes location entirely.
By the middle of the 2010s, you could get as much parallel hardware as you were willing to pay for. But for one very important class of problem, you couldn't actually use it.
Which class?
Sequences. Language, speech, anything where order carries meaning. The dominant approach was recurrent. You process a sequence one element at a time, and the computation at each step depends on the state produced by the step before it.
So step 10 needs step 9 to have finished.
Step 10 needs step 9, which needed step 8, and so on back to the beginning of the sentence. That's a serial dependency. And critically, it does not live in the hardware. It lives in the method.
And you can't parallelize your way out of a dependency.
You cannot, by definition. This is the Amdahl argument from episode 4, moved up one level. There we said most ordinary software has a sequential fraction that caps what extra cores can do for it. Here, the sequential fraction is inside the model itself, and buying more hardware does nothing about it.
So for a while, the machine was wider than the method could use.
Which is a genuinely strange situation, and it's the mirror image of everything in the previous 4 episodes. For 60 years, the idea waited on the machine. Here, briefly, the machine is sitting there waiting on the idea.
And I want to be fair to recurrent models because they tend to get dismissed in retrospect.
So do I, and it matters. They weren't bad. They were state-of-the-art for years. They did an enormous amount of real work. And processing a sequence in order is a perfectly reasonable thing for a model of sequences to do. Being serial in the sequence dimension is a property, not a defect. It simply turned out to be the wrong property for the hardware that existed.
And then, 2017.
A paper published in June 2017 called Attention is All You Need. The architecture it describes removes the recurrence entirely. Instead of walking along a sequence step by step, every position is compared against every other position, and all of those comparisons can be computed at the same time.
So the serial dependency is gone.
In the sequence dimension, gone. What you're left with is a very large amount of matrix arithmetic with almost no ordering constraint inside a training step.
Which is the workload shape from episode 4.
It is precisely the workload shape from episode 4, the one that splits perfectly across parallel hardware. And that's why this is the hinge of the episode. The method has become the thing the hardware was already extremely good at.
Now, was that the point? Did they design it that way to suit the hardware?
I want to be careful here because this gets overclaimed constantly. The motivation set out in the paper is about modeling sequences and about training efficiency. Parallelism is discussed openly as a benefit. But I'm not going to tell you the architecture was reverse engineered from a hardware specification because that isn't what the paper claims and I can't support it.
So the fit is real, but the intent is weaker than the popular version.
The fit is real. The fit is a large part of why it won so decisively and so fast. And the intent is something you should either state carefully or leave alone. Those are different claims, and only one of them is documented.
And after this, the direction genuinely does reverse.
After this, the method is stable enough, general enough, and economically valuable enough that it becomes worth building dedicated silicon for. And that had essentially never been true of a general AI method in the entire history we've covered.
So what does hardware built for a method actually look like in practice?
2 examples, both from roughly the same window. Google announced a chip called the Tensor processing unit at its developer conference in May 2016, and said at the time that it had already been running inside its own data centers for more than a year.
So it was announced after it was already in production.
Which tells you something on its own. This was not a research prototype looking for a use. It was built because an organization with an enormous internal workload had concluded that a general-purpose part was the wrong tool for the job it actually had.
And the second example?
In 2017, NVIDIA's new GPU generation added units called Tensor cores, 640 of them on the V100, hardware dedicated to exactly the matrix operation these models are made of, sitting inside an otherwise general-purpose graphics processor. So you get the specialization without giving up the general-purpose part.
And that is the reversal, stated in silicon.
That's the reversal, made physical. In episode 4, the hardware existed for completely unrelated reasons, video games, and the method found it by accident. Here, the method exists first. It's economically important, and the hardware is deliberately built toward it.
One correction I want to make, because people get this wrong a lot.
Go ahead.
TPUs did not replace GPUs. Google built them for Google's own workloads. The broader market stayed on general-purpose graphics processors, and to a large extent still does.
That's right. And it matters for the argument rather than being a detail. This isn't the story of one architecture defeating another. It's the beginning of a pattern where large operators build their own silicon, precisely because the method has become stable enough to be worth targeting for years at a time.
There's a third response that's much less visible than a new chip, and I think it's the most revealing of the three.
Precision. Traditionally, you did this kind of arithmetic with quite precise numbers, because that's what scientific and engineering computing needed. But it turns out these models tolerate substantially less precision than that without meaningfully worse results.
And if you need fewer bits per number,
then you fit more numbers into the same memory, you move them across the chip faster, and you can build arithmetic units that are smaller and pack more of them into the same area. You get considerably more useful work per chip without the chip getting better in any classical sense.
Which is a very direct case of hardware being reshaped around a property of the method.
It's the clearest case in the episode, and it's why I wanted it in here rather than as a footnote. Nobody discovered a new physical principle. Somebody measured that this particular workload doesn't need the precision the hardware had been providing, and then the hardware was redesigned around that tolerance.
And the cost? Because this usually gets presented as a pure win.
It isn't free, and I want to say that plainly. You're trading numerical range and accuracy for throughput and memory. Making low-precision training stable took real engineering work. It needed new number formats. And it doesn't work equally well for every part of every model.
So it's a tolerance being exploited, not a limitation being removed.
That's the honest framing. And it only works at all because somebody went and measured a property of the method, which is, again, the method leading and the hardware following.
Now the consequence, and this is the one I'd want people to actually sit with.
Once the amount of computation you can bring to an idea is a purchasing decision rather than a physical limit, the binding constraint stops being physics and becomes capital.
Which sounds like a liberation.
It is a liberation for anyone who has the capital. The ceiling that held for 60 years is genuinely gone. You are no longer sitting there waiting on somebody else's manufacturing roadmap to move.
And for everyone else?
For everyone else, the ceiling didn't disappear. It changed owner. It used to be set by what a chip could do. And that was the same ceiling for you, for your competitor, and for a graduate student anywhere in the world. Now it's set by what you can spend. And that is emphatically not the same for everyone.
And that concentrates who gets to test an idea at the frontier
into a comparatively small number of organizations. And here's the connection I think matters most in this whole episode. That is episode 2's failure mode coming back around.
Say that one carefully.
Episode 2 was about a field reading untestable as refuted, because the machines of the day simply couldn't run the experiment that would have settled the question. If frontier-scale experiments can only be run by a handful of organizations, then ideas outside those organizations become untestable again, for financial reasons this time, rather than physical ones.
And the historical lesson is that untestable tends to get treated as unpromising.
That's what happened last time, and it cost the field something like 2 decades. I'm not predicting it happens again. I don't know that, and the situation isn't identical. What I'm saying is that the mechanism which produced it last time is present again, and it's better to watch for it deliberately than to be surprised by it in retrospect.
So let's state the loop as it now exists, because it isn't accidental anymore.
Methods specify what hardware ought to be good at. Hardware then makes those particular methods cheap to run. Cheap methods get tried far more often by far more people. The results of all that trying justify the next generation of hardware aimed at the same methods.
Which is an extremely effective machine for making one thing better very quickly.
Extraordinarily effective. And that's not a criticism. Almost everything you've seen in AI over the last several years comes out of that loop running fast and running well. Nobody should want it to stop.
And the trap?
The trap is in the last step. When silicon gets built for a method, the method that has silicon wins. And the method that has silicon is not the same category as the best method available.
Which is episode 3 all over again.
It's episode 3, one level up. There, the evaluation function was handmade, so the machine could only ever be good at what its builders already understood. Here, the hardware itself is functioning as a kind of evaluation, It quietly decides which ideas are cheap enough to be worth trying at all.
So, the question to leave people with.
If a genuinely different architecture appeared tomorrow, one that doesn't decompose neatly into enormous parallel matrix operations, would we actually be able to tell that it was better? Or would we only be able to observe that it runs badly on hardware that was built for something else?
And that isn't rhetorical. There's a tell.
There's a tell, and it's the same one we named in episode 4. Watch for whether a method that fits the silicon poorly ever gets a serious, properly resourced attempt anyway. If that essentially never happens, then we aren't selecting for the best idea anymore. We're selecting for the best supported one, and those come apart more often than anyone would like.
Next time, the correction to all of this.
Next time, when bigger stopped meaning better. An algorithmic result showed that an enormous amount of that compute had been spent the wrong way round, and the bottleneck moved again out of raw scale and into memory.
That's a wrap. If this made AI a little clearer, hit subscribe. It helps more curious people find the show. See you next time.